Zenaburiani, Iposhilamu, Ipu. Mami Ekame, Matuyanu, Washupielani, Mutuame. Naramatu, Deni, Biamito, Gamoni. Washini, Mupemuka, Yuna, Tuatome. Euna Mari, Uriayu, Nabami. Azondera, Yakem, Tuan, Sherry, Siaman. No makupi, moyo matuoyo. Amina tumisha mishaka, kuntwa si shabolu. Oh oh oh, si c'est compliqué ça. Oh 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 oh, na 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 na. Tiririra, 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 tiririra. Imam. Julian, Iposhilamu, Ibiti, so people get up with your luna, Pulana, that policeman. I mean, it do, Denny. I shall be you, I'm getting up. Nana, oh, I dear, you now, oh, you now, I want to make Mamma to get in. You're the one that for you, for many. I mean, I'll do me some shaka, who see shampoo. Oh, 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 si c'est compliqué, ça. Oh, 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 na, 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 na. No, 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 c'est compliqué, ça. Oh, 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 na, 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 na. No, 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 compliqué, ça. No, 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 na, 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 na. No, 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 c'est compliqué, c'est compliqué, c'est compliqué. Na, 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 na. No, 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 c'est compliqué, c'est compliqué, c'est compliqué. Allez, na, 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 na.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this award ceremony for the Justus Liebig-Award for World Nutrition. We're extremely happy and proud that we are having this event here at ZEF. Usually this is awarded every other year, so every 2 years, but usually it's happening at the University of Hohenheim. And for different reasons, it didn't work out this time at Hohenheim, and we have the chance to have this event here at ZEF, and we are happy and proud of that. Happy for at least 3 reasons. I mean, the first reason is that food security and world nutrition is obviously a topic that's close to our hearts. It's close to our work here at ZEF. And that's why we're happy to have such an event here. Secondly, because this is the prize as such is sponsored by the Fiat Panis Foundation. All of you know the Fiat Panis Foundation. Probably all of you also know that we have a very long-standing partnership and relationship with the Fiat Panis Foundation. So we're happy for that reason as well. And the third reason that makes us proud is, of course, our prize awarding or awarded person, Louise Fresco. She is, well, a person that doesn't need a lot of introduction. Certainly worth, praiseworthy, and you have deserved the prize more than anyone else for various reasons. I mean, your career is so closely connected to the topic of the prize, food security and nutrition, but from various angles. I mean, you're a brilliant researcher, you're a brilliant policymaker, institution builder, bridge builder, and we're extremely happy to have this ceremony here today. One thing that I should announce is that we will certainly hear a lecture by Louise Fresco later, and usually, you're getting a lecture by the laureate, and then everybody is happy. But Louise Fresco asked us, no, I want to have some discussion. So during the lecture, listen and prepare for questions. Whatever may be of interest related to the topic, so that it's not completely a surprise when we say, and now it's open for questions. So be prepared. But I would also like to welcome a few others. Dr. Andrea Fadani, who is the executive director of the Fiat Panis Foundation. We're happy to have you here. The award jury that's represented by Ursula Schäfer-Preuß, Frank Plessmann, and Joachim von Braun today. We have previous von Liebig-Award winners, Eva and Fred Welzin-Ratunde. And we obviously have many others from CEF, from like-minded organizations here in Bonn, from other universities, from Germany and abroad. And that's great to have you all here. So the program is full. You have seen that, various points, and we don't want to lose any time. And I hand over to Dr. Andrea Fadani for a few introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Martin Keim. What a pleasure to be here at Bonn, at CEF, to present the Justus von Liebig-Award for World Nutrition. Today we celebrate for the 7th time the award for World Nutrition, which is named after Justus von Liebig. The award was originally endowed by the Alfred Töpfer Foundation in Hamburg between 1949 and 2006. During that period, the prize was awarded to 76 distinguished individuals who had made outstanding contribution to the science and practical agriculture in Europe. Alfred Töpfer's idea was shortly after the Second World War to honor those researchers and practical farmers who made possible that Europe was getting self-sufficient in the area of food. At that time, it was an award for ending hunger in Europe. The granddaughter of Alfred Töpfer, Charlotte Töpfer, planned to join us today, but unfortunately, she was not able to make it here to our wonderful occasion, but her husband, Frank Plessmann, is joining us. Best regards to the Töpfer family and to your wife. When Dr. Hermann Eiselen heard that the Alfred Töpfer Foundation planned in 2008 to change their award system and ending with this prestigious award, he asked Birte Töpfer, the former head of the board of trustees of the Alfred Töpfer Foundation, whether the Eiselen Foundation would be able to continue with the Justus von Liebig Award. And Dr. Eiselen received a positive reaction by the official of the Töpfer Foundation. On the basis of an agreement with the Töpfer Foundation, the Eiselen Foundation continued the award with a slightly changed aspiration in 2009. Now, we look for those researchers and practical workers who will help to end hunger on our planet Earth. After the death of Dr. Eiselen, the Foundation Fiat Panis took over the Justus von Liebig Award for World Nutrition in 2010. Individuals, associations, or institutions who made preeminent contributions to the improvement of world food supply or the mitigation of under- and malnourishment are eligible to be nominated. There are no national or other limitations, and the prize can be awarded for both singular achievements or contributions and lifetime accomplishments. The prize is endowed with 25,000 euros. The decision on the winner will be made by an independent jury. Professor Keim mentioned already Ursula Schäfer-Preuß, There is also Lucia Reich. There is also Anton von Dornmalen, Frank Plessmann, and Joachim von Braun. I thank them all for their work in selecting the award winner for this year, and I'm so glad that nearly the entire jury is present today. The famous Justus von Liebig was a German chemist and who made major contributions to agriculture and biological chemistry, and was considered the founder of organic chemistry. He emphasized on the essential plant nutrients. All we learned who studied agriculture sciences, his formulation of the law of the minimum, which described the effect of nutrients on crops. He was one of the most talented scientists in his time. But there is a second Justus von Liebig. In later life, he became scientific advisor to King Maximilian II of Bavaria, who was willing to transform the University of Munich into a center for scientific research and development. In his lifetime, he made enormous contribution that scientific progress was serving our civilization. Already in the late 19th century, in remembrance of this great scientist, a gold and a silver Liebig medal was awarded to deserving German scientists with the motto, "For the purpose of encouraging research in agriculture science." Today, the Foundation Fiat Panis honors with its Justus von Liebig-Award for World Nutrition Professor Dr. Louise Fresco for her outstanding achievements in creating sustainable agriculture development and her contribution to improving world nutrition. Her life's work has been in the service of a world free of hunger. I'm delighted that Professor Joachim von Braun, member of the jury for this award, was willing to take over the laudatio for our award winner. Please, Professor von Braun.
Good afternoon. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear Louise Fresco, dear committee, it's my pleasure to give this laudatio. Before I do that, let me add one piece of information about Justus von Liebig. Justus von Liebig experimented as a schoolboy with material that made noise, the cracker, the silver cracker. So he combined silver with some acids, and this noise making fascinated him. And then he identified the chemical process that made that crack. And that brought him the professorship in Gießen at age 21. So making noise for the fun of it, and then finding out what's behind it, I think is important for our present doctoral students here in the room. But I think it also somewhat relates to you, Louise, and your career. I have structured my presentation into 3 topics. Louise Fresco, the scientist, Louise Fresco, the development actor, and Louise Fresco, the poet, the writer. Let me take these 3 aspects of your life and your contributions to changing mindsets in this sequence. Louise Fresco is a scientist and the science policy change maker. Well, I'm not going back to your school time, but to your doctoral dissertation, which you find on the internet. And I advise you, again, doctoral students in the room, to read it. Louise obtained her doctoral degree in tropical plant breeding and production systems in 1986 from Wageningen University. Her field work was done in what was called then Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The title is Cassava and Shifting Cultivation, a Systems Approach to Agricultural Technology Development in Africa. A systems approach. She emphasized and I emphasize. It points already to her deep understanding of food systems that she revealed then again recently as a vice chair of the scientific group for the UN Secretary General's United Nations Food Systems Summit last year. The last section of her dissertation has the heading, The African Crisis Reconsidered. I quote from this last section. Louise writes, "Two last questions remain. Firstly, one may wonder about the usefulness of a systems approach in the analysis of food production in Africa. I am of the opinion that the ecological systems model presented in this study can be helpful in understanding the nature and causes of the African crisis," she writes. "For one thing, it shows that the crisis manifests itself at each level of the hierarchy in the shape of exogenous constraints and endogenous limitations. Secondly," I keep quoting, she asks, "has the preceding analysis of changes in cassava production thrown any light of the African crisis?" She continues to say, "I believe it has in several ways." A bold statement of a doctoral student. I believe it has. It shows the importance of looking in detail at how crop production has evolved under very adverse circumstances. The expansion of rain-fed arable cropping in a humid environment requires the replacement of shifting cultivation by sustainable, intensified cropping and farming systems. The technologies for this type of land utilization in the fragile ecosystems of Africa are only emerging. I believe a lot of more research is needed. That guided the future of her life. A lot of more research was needed. Louise Fresco, soon thereafter, was professor of plant production systems at Wageningen University, specializing in tropical regions. Later, she was a university professor of the University of Amsterdam, and as we all know, as president of the Wageningen University and Research Executive Board from July 2014 until June of this year. She was instrumental for Wageningen's top position in the world's agricultural university. Wageningen, we somewhat enviously can say, in the field of agriculture is number one. Her science is well acknowledged. Louise is an elected member of several significant academies of arts and science at home and abroad. The list is long. You can check it. Let me come to my second facet of Louise, the development actor in public and private sector. There were many functions. Let me point out that from January 2000 to May 2006, Louise was the Assistant Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, responsible for technological issues in the area of agricultural production. An Assistant Director General is a high position in the FAO. She resigned from that position with a bang, a big bang. If you, ladies and gentlemen, ever consider resigning from a safe and well-paid job, a lesson from Louise is consider not only the resignation, but also how to resign. Louis' letter of resignation gives you some guidance. It was published in The Guardian, the newspaper The Guardian, May 14, 2006. It started by being addressed to Monsieur le Directeur Général of FAO, and I quote only 3 points from the 2-page letter, which I believe you, Louise, have crafted very carefully. It points out the beliefs of our laureate. Louise writes, I believe in an organization which is not afraid to make clear and precise choices, learning from the past without taking the past as a recipe for the future. I believe in an organization where we worry less about rules and more about the impact of our work. I believe in an organization which sees its staff as a source of inspiration and allows them to be mobile and grow. I believe these beliefs should also apply to our wonderful university. And I think they do. That was my addition to the 3 beliefs of Louise Fresco. Past her resignation came new successes. Louise was on the board of Syngenta Company, of Unilever and Rabobank Netherlands, the professor in Amsterdam, and then the president already mentioned in Wageningen University. She's a member of the Council of Advisors of the World Food Prize. Louise Fresco did not forget her country, where she is from, the country in which Germany's Nazi occupation created hunger, the Dutch famine in 1944-45. Louise Fresco serves as a member of the ambassadors of the Dutch National Holocaust Museum, which will be opening, I think, later next year or early 24. Ladies and gentlemen, let me come to my third and last characteristic of Louise Fresco. Louise Fresco is a poet, engaging in culture of food and agriculture and beyond agriculture. Let me turn first again to the young Louise. She put up front in her doctoral dissertation in 1986 a quote from V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel laureate literature 2001. Not from the bend of the river, but from an essay. An essay in which VSN reflects somewhat sarcastically on ideological contradictions postulated on agricultural strategies in Africa. I do not give you that quote because I want you to pick up that essay from VSN, Naipaul, or the dissertation from Louise. Louise wanted to overcome such confusions as they are still around today, ideological confusions postulating this versus that and seeing no bridges between this and that. So she wanted to overcome these confusions, and she did to a large extent, which is one other aspect why you, Louise, deserve this prize so eminently. Louise Fresco wrote about 7 novels. I hope you are writing an 8th one, of which The Utopians was nominated for the Libris Literature Prize in 2008. Let me mention a few of the titles of her novels using Dutch language, which I do not master. But they are understandable even to the German speaker. There's one, the Cosmopoliten. Another one, the Tuin van de Sultan van Rome, der Sultan von Rome. The Utopisten I mentioned already. The Idealisten. And in October 2012, Louise Fresco published a book which made her famous, if she wasn't already. It's titled Hamburgers in Paradise. Hamburgers in Paradise. Food in Times of Scarcity and Abundance is the full title. In Hamburgers in Paradise, Louise Fresco considers and confronts the two contradictory images: the earthly paradise and the hamburger. In her analysis, she notes that appearances can be very misleading. The link between the hamburger and the paradise lost, the lost paradise, is one that many consumers do not make. Lastly, I want to draw your attention to her most recent novel. It's called The Plantjager uit Leningrad. A second edition is published. The story runs as follows. The young Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov, the plant breeders among you know whom I'm talking about, Ms. Velzin. Nikolai Vavilov becomes fascinated with wild wheat varieties in the inhospitable valleys of Central Asia. The key to improving agriculture, especially for poor Russian farmers, he believed lies in a pioneering idea of crossbreeding with wild specimens. Vavilov hunted for plants around the world and created a very large collection of seeds. But in Russia, in the meantime, in those days, the communists had become the holders of power, and with them a deadly mix of ideology and pseudo-science. Vavilov's opposite was Trofim Lysenko, fortunately largely forgotten today, who promised scientific miracles and was used by Stalin to push through totally impossible reforms. Lysenko rejected genetics as detected by Gregor Mendel, and pushed his pseudo-scientific ideas. He became director of the Institute of Genetics within the USSR Academy of Science, used his political influence and power to suppress dissenting opinions. Soviet scientists who refused to renounce genetics were dismissed, and many were sentenced to death, including Nikolai Vavilov. Lysenko's ideas and practices contributed to the famines that killed millions of Soviet people. In your book, The Plant Hunter from Leningrad, you follow the hope and despair of a driven scientist until Stalin's nets closed around him. This work is relevant today as we need to protect plant genetic resources in situ and ex situ. In the Ukraine of today, attacked by Russia, the country's gene bank is at risk. A couple of months ago, a bomb nearly hit the gene bank, which at that point was not yet duplicated in other gene banks. In closing, Professor Louise Fresco is an original thinker, guided by science, expressing independent views on the food system issues she cares about. She has a deep understanding of the societal questions related to agriculture and food. Simply writing science was not good enough for Louise. It had to be novels, captivating novels. Louise Fresco argues for change where needed, knowing that current agricultural systems must become more sustainable while providing sufficient and nutritious food for the people. We congratulate you, Louise. Thank you for your attention.
The Foundation Fiat Panis honors Professor Dr. Louise Fresco with its Justus von Liebig-Award for World Nutrition 2022. The award winner received the amount of €25,000. Ulm, Bonn, November 28, 2022, the Executive Director and the jury of the award. I quote the jury. Professor Fresco has made extraordinary contributions to agriculture research and development for improving world food security and in providing leadership for a wide range of research initiatives that aim to develop new solutions for sustainable agriculture systems. Having served as Assistant Director General at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Rome, and as a leading member of international scientific advisory mechanisms in the public and private sector, she has achieved highest international recognition for her expertise and has been at the forefront of food system development issues. As president of Wageningen University and Research, she provided leadership in innovations for the sustainable agriculture system for a more food secure and poverty-free world. She also successfully mobilized next generation and youth actors in this agenda. For these reasons, the Foundation Fiat Panis is proud to present Professor Dr. Louise Fresco with the Justus Liebig Award for World Nutrition 2022. Congratulations. And there is more. There is more. Please give me the chance. There is also the medal of Justus von Liebig with your name on the back.
Thank you.
There is more. Zeph is so well organized. The flowers for the lawyer.
Depuis très longtemps, je viens de loin, j'ai les pieds pleins de poussière, j'ai un sac qui est presque vide. Je veux que tu m'accueilles un peu chez toi. Just try to feel what I feel, so we may have one face for a moment. Come closer, touch me, you might feel Ishiro. if I could do better. Oh, I said, if I could do better. If I could do better, what time is she on? We down the road, my way. Yo, yo. Represent. If I could do better. Represent. If I could do better.
Ladies and gentlemen, and especially, of course, Professor Chaim, Dr. Fadani, and Professor von Braun, lieber Joachim, I don't know what to say, frankly. You make it seem so wonderful. I really am touched by your words and by the distinction that you are bestowing upon me. I don't think I ever thought about that when I wrote my PhD or even before that. Life, and I'm saying this particularly to the young people in the room, life may look very planned afterwards, but when you're in the middle of it, it just goes and flows, and you just try to be honest to yourself and try to do your best. And perhaps that's the best lesson I can give to anybody. But yes, this is a special prize to me. First of all, because of Justus von Liebig himself. For me, he is one of the great, in terms of the thinkers about agriculture, together with Vavilov, together with also Darwin, Georg Melno, and a couple of others. Why is von Liebig so important to me? Basically because of 4 dimensions, and you touched upon them a little bit. He was the first person to really start systematically on experimental research, not just in agriculture, but in many fields. He was also, something that not many people know, the first one who showed that the CO2 in plants, or the carbon in plants, did not come from the soil, as was previously thought, but actually came from the air. In other words, he made us understand the process of photosynthesis much better than we had ever before. And I'll come back to that in a minute. He was also, of course, the inventor, if you want, or the one who laid the basic foundations of fertilizers. And that's probably a subject that is not very much loved by people today, but I feel is extremely important, and that is the use of fertilizer in tropical agriculture. Tropical soils, because of the climate, are usually among the poorest of the world, unless they are derived from volcanic origin. So fertilizer is key to the future, and so von Liebig's thinking is key to the future. And fourthly, he was also very much interested in the biochemistry of nutrition. He developed all kinds of things that made nutrition better, including the famous von Liebig cube, the stock, the one for the bouillon, which we still use, or some of us today. So von Liebig was important, and I have always been aware of the fact that he was somebody who built the bridge between agriculture and food by working on such a broad fundamental basis of science. And in fact, when I was a student, that was not very popular. Wageningen gave me a chance as a student to look at both agriculture and nutrition, because we only had one faculty and nobody cared what you tried to read as classes. So I did about everything I could imagine to do. And that has been a very good basis. So the system thinking, which certainly when I was an undergraduate student was not a word we used, actually was ingrained in my own interests, both in nutrition and food and agriculture, and later on what we started calling the food chain. Now, when von Liebig grew up, so at the beginning of the 19th century, the average life expectancy of people on Earth, and certainly in Western Europe, was no more than 30 to 40 years. So imagine as we sit in this room, if you look at your two neighbors, you know, well, you don't need to look them into the eyes very deeply, but just look at your two neighbors and you realize that only one of the three would actually survive beyond the age of 40. That was the situation. And he was, in fact, very lucky. Von Liebig was as old as I am today when he died. And I hope I have a few more years before I die. This is how life expectancy has actually grown. So in von Liebig's time, hunger and poverty and poor lives, including, of course, the lack of mobility, were great issues. Now, fast forward to 50 years ago, half a century ago, when I became a student. That was a very different time in some ways from today, but also from von Liebig's time. At that time, world population stood at 3.5 billion people. Today, of course, you know, we just celebrated, in a way, the 8 billionth person on Earth. Of those 3.5 billion, 1/3 was still malnourished. Malnourished both in terms of the quantity and the quality of food. But the late 1960s, early 1970s were very different in many ways from today. It was still, of course, the height of the Cold War. We didn't think at all about climate change. If there was one thing that worried us, it was nuclear change, or rather nuclear winter. That was the worry at the time. It was also, as some of you in this room may remember, a time of student protests, May 68, the French protests. But it was also a time at which all kinds of changes started in science as well. Not least, of course, to our topic today, the Green Revolution. You know, the Green Revolution, that effort to breed varieties that would be more responsive to water, fertilizer, and biocides, that would help to grow better food, and more quickly. And yes, that was successful. India became, from a food importer and from a country where there was real famine, an exporter after a couple of decades. But in the early 1970s, famines were still around. They were not a distant memory. They were around. We had just had Biafra, and there were several other famines that were very much on people's minds. Biafra was the first very well documented famine. And it's the images of Biafra that certainly have influenced some of my choices. Seeing these emaciated children, their mothers desperate because they couldn't feed the children, made a lasting impression on me. That was the late 70s. What happened, of course, after that, you know very well, not just the fall of the Berlin Wall, but the entry of China into the World Trade Organization and a slow but steady globalization. More science applied to agriculture, higher yields in many parts of the world, and over the long term, a change in food prices, a decline by about 1% to 2% a year. Was all well? No, of course not. There were many things that were not well. And of course, the big one of that is that we understood that the Green Revolution, just working on the plant side, not looking at the whole system, not looking at food as it came to the table, was actually not enough. It was a condition sine qua non, an essential condition to increase food production, but it wasn't enough. It was only in the 80s and 90s, slowly, that more food became available, and that all of us today, as we sit in this room, if you look at it in a historical perspective, we belong to the 1 or 2% of the overall world population all through history that have grown up in an age of average abundance. But I'm saying average abundance because at the time, and certainly today, there is still hunger. Hunger has not been eradicated. And in fact, it has become more complicated. No, we're not at 1/3 hungry people. We're about, we are different percentages depending on how we define it. The UN defines food security as the accessibility or the access to food that people actually accept as part of their culture, tradition, all throughout the year, which is accessible, which is safe and nutritious. That is not the case for many people. It's not the case for many people, even if food has become cheaper. And in Western Europe, in the 1970s, and certainly the 50s and 60s, the after-war decades, the average household spent about 50 to 60% on food. Today, it is on average for Europe between 10 and 15%. And guess what? The Dutch and the Germans, of course, are at the lower side of 10% of household income. The French, of course, and the Italians are at 15%. There is a cultural difference there. But nevertheless, it's much less than the 50 to 60%. However, that doesn't apply to many countries in the world. In a country like Madagascar, even today, most households spend about 60 to 80% of their income on food. So although overall prices on the world market have declined, it's the accessibility to food that is a key issue. So food in other ways has to be not just nutritious, it has to be also safe from contamination and infections and so on. But it has also to be affordable, and it has to be produced sustainably. And these last two dimensions of affordability and sustainability are all related to poverty. And if we analyze where we see food insecurity today, it is really very much related to affordability. And I only have to quote the Senator McGovern, also presidential candidate at the time, and American ambassador, including to Rome, who said, "Poverty and food are weapons of mass destruction. If you don't deal with them, they can really create havoc." And I still think that is true today. If we look at Southern Sudan, the Horn of Africa, or even Ukraine, and even what's happening today, food is indeed a weapon of mass destruction. And I would hope that at some stage this will also be recognized by the various international courts. So where do we stand today in understanding food security? Where is it? Who is food insecure? Well, basically, I think there are three categories of people. First of all, we have those, about 820 to 900 million, depending a little bit on the year, who are acutely food insecure. These are people who live in war zones, who are refugees, or in areas of civil strife. Think Eastern Congo, the Horn of Africa, Syria, and so on and so forth. These are people who are at the vagaries of groups taking food to them or stealing food for them. Those are the most acute situations, both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. But that's not the only thing. We have about perhaps even as many as 2 billion people. All this is very difficult to calculate exactly, as you can imagine. 2 billion people who do not get throughout the year all the nutrients that they need. They may get sufficient calories, but they do not get the vitamins and minerals that are necessary. Both groups together, I mean, the first group, the 900 million, of course, also don't get their nutrients. So the 2 billion is including in that group. That means that 1/4 of the world population does not get adequate food. And as you very well know, a pregnant woman or a young child growing up without the vitamins, particularly iron, and some other minerals, really is at risk of brain damage, of risk of growing up stunted, at risk of not being able to participate in society. And one of the worst things for parents is not to be able to feed your child. So this is still the case for about 1/4 of the world population. Not all the time, apart from those 900 million, but certainly part of the time. So in that sense, we haven't done very well. But there is more. There's about 1.5 billion people, and some even say perhaps up to 2 billion, who are people actually mostly in affluent countries who are either overweight or obese. It's a problem of affluence, but it's a problem very much also of malnutrition, because if you're obese in particular, you actually suffer from a kind of syndrome which is very much handicapping your body to take up the right kinds of nutrients. Who are those people? These are people in poor countries. They're people or in rich countries who are poor, who have no access to vegetables and fruits, who have no access to the right types of minerals, who are often eating fast food, very often in households where there's only a single parent and where the head of the household just has no time to give food, adequate food to the children or to cook. These are people who have 2 or 3 jobs, are exhausted, and just buy a slice of pizza or a hamburger for the children to eat in front of the television. So in all, my 2 billion and the 1.5 to 2 billion of overweight and obese together makes 4 billion. And 4 billion is half of the world population. And that is where we stand today. I'm not saying that they are in acute need, apart from the 900 million I mentioned earlier, all the time. But their nutrition situation is not good. So this is our first task, to really look at what are the factors. And of course, one cannot generalize. The situation in the United States is very different from the situation in Mexico, for example. And the country that has most obese people as a percentage of the population is actually Mexico, not the United States. But it just shows you how quickly things have evolved from the 1950s. So what are we to do? Well, first of all, it's not just a matter of producing more food, although I want to say that this is absolutely crucial. We are at 8 billion today. World population will grow at the end of this century probably to 10 billion. It will level off and even go in decline in the course of the 22nd century. And in Europe, of course, as you know, it will already decline as from the middle of this century onwards. But we still have to produce for a quarter more of the current population in the world. And that growth in food production will be more than just a quarter more in terms of volume, because there's also a shift in terms of the demand for meat, animal products, fruits and vegetables, which is not met. So that's the first challenge. We do have to produce more food. It's not a matter, of course, that we can do it. Yes, we can, technically, but it doesn't happen by itself. But unfortunately, there's a lot more that faces us today. There are a lot more challenges. And just to name you a couple. First of all, we have a very rapid urbanization in the world. Already more than half of the world population lives in cities. That will be 2/3 by the middle of this century. And that means declining population in rural areas. That means less labor in rural areas. That means people living in slums. Today already in the megapolises, the mega cities of the world, 1/3 of the population lives in slums. No access to land, often no access to water, no access to jobs or very small jobs. All these people are at risk. Even if they're not at risk today, they may be unless something happens. So the rural-urban balance is very important, because if we have people in cities, who is there in the rural areas to do the work of agriculture? The elderly, the women, the children? Will they really be able to produce that extra 1/4 plus that we need? That's the first challenge. The second challenge is, of course, the issue of climate change. Farmers, in a way, don't care so much about climate change. They care about fluctuations from season to season. That's their reality. And whether there's a long-term trend or not is usually not that important. But these fluctuations in terms of drought and heat are really affecting agriculture production. By the way, not only negatively, because the heating up of the earth actually means that certain zones for production will actually move northwards on on some of the northern continents, meaning China, Russia, Scandinavia, and Canada, and the United States. The growing seasons will lengthen. That means very concretely that, for example, the area in China where you can grow wheat will move up by about 100 kilometers in the next few decades. So it's not only negative, but most of it, particularly in countries that are prone to droughts, this is a real issue. But climate change also means that agriculture and the food industry have to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. Not only adaptation to new conditions, but also carbon storage in the soil and in the land. And that is very interesting, because it actually means, as a corollary, that we have to try to keep as much land as we can under natural vegetation, either forests or grasslands or peatlands, which are real sinks, as we call them, for carbon. That means, in other words, that we have to increase productivity on the land that we have currently cleared and not clear new land. And that's the greatest challenge. Where can we have the better yields so that we don't expand the land area, but keep that land either for biodiversity or for carbon storage? That's a big issue. The next big issue is, of course, energy. On the one hand, energy is an issue for agriculture and for food systems because of the energy needed in production, in transportation, in cooling, and in processing. But of course, agriculture can also be a source of energy. And here I'm not referring so much to biofuels, because I think that to use good land and crops that people can eat to burn as biofuels is not a good idea, notwithstanding the plans of the United States government to continue subsidizing this. I don't think that is the solution in the long term. But we have plant byproducts that can be used as biomass. And most importantly, something that we should consider from, say, 2050 onwards, when we're phasing out really drastically fossil fuels, is the substitution of what we call the petrochemicals, the chemicals that we now derive from fossil fuels and that we use for all kinds of industrial processes. Think plastics, all kinds of other things, chemicals, enzymes that come from the byproducts of fossil fuels and then have to come from agriculture. So agriculture will not just become a producer of food or feed or fiber, but also a producer of useful chemicals to replace the petrochemical industry. That in itself is a huge challenge. But we're not yet there. I talked about urbanization, climate change, energy, but of course one of the big issues is protein. Protein is essential to all of us. It's in all our bodies. We need to eat it every day. And as people become more affluent, the demand for animal protein grows. Do we need animal protein, and how can we deal with it? Well, firstly, it's very difficult not to have animal protein because it is such a concentrated foodstuff for those people who really need it. Pregnant women, lactating women, children, and the elderly who have small stomachs and who need that concentrated food. There's very little you can find unless you're talking about eggs, and so I'm not talking only about meat, eggs and milk that are of such high density of so many nutrients and minerals. However, all of us, as we sit here, are healthy individuals. We need very little in terms of animal protein. But of course, there are large parts of the world's surface that you cannot use for crops. That land is either too cold, too steep, too stony, too wet, but animals can graze. So the conversion of a vegetation, grass and so on, that we as humans cannot convert to something that we can eat and is of high quality in a total global food system will remain important. But not necessarily, or certainly not, the use of very large tracts of land to grow feed for animals. But just to take China alone, China cannot feed its own population, as you probably know. It imports very massively feed stocks from Brazil, the United States, and so on. In fact, the world market price for grains is often determined by the demand from China. So animal production will be there. Of course, aquaculture is still a different story. We can probably get more from the oceans or from growing fish on the land. But the real challenge is, I think, to look at other species to feed our protein needs. And that could be either fungi, bacteria, and so on and so forth. Animal production will not go away, but the big transition is going to be to wean people off, or rich people, I should say, affluent people, healthy people, off most of the meat they're eating. And hopefully, we did some calculations in Wageningen for Europe, we can probably end up with 1/3 animal proteins and 2/3 plant proteins by 2050. But we're not yet there at all. And in fact, meat production is either stable or even increasing in most of the countries we're talking about. And of course, it's growing very rapidly as the emerging economies become even more affluent. Lastly, in my challenges, there's another one. And that is that we need to move towards a more circular economy. We are wasting not just food, but we're wasting molecules. We're wasting enzymes. We have a lot of stuff in our sewage systems that we are actually just letting going literally down the drain to the sea. We should really retrieve whatever we have, phosphate, enzymes, all kinds of molecules that are useful. Whether you can make a system really closed or not depends a little bit on the scale you're talking about. No system is entirely closed, not even the Earth itself, since it gets energy from the sun. But certainly we can do better, and we must do better in moving towards a circular economy where agriculture and food production play an important role. So if we challenge all this and we manage this, are we okay? Well, not necessarily. Because one of the issues that has come up in the last few decades, perhaps 2 decades, is an increasing misunderstanding about the nature of agriculture and food, particularly in the global north, in the rich countries, the OECD countries. And that is the idea that we really don't need a lot of knowledge anymore, that there are other factors and it's not a matter of production, it's a matter of distribution and so on. So let me deal with a few misunderstandings there. The first misunderstanding is, of course, that small is beautiful. The smaller the farm, the more wonderful it is, the more harmonious with nature, and so on and so forth. That is a fallacy. Small is not necessarily beautiful. Small often means poverty. Small means that you cannot invest in increasing production, and small is very difficult when you have already labor shortages. And trust me, most small farmers that I know in the world, particularly in the developing world, do not want to remain small farmers. They want to grow, they want to have enough income for their families, they want their children to be socially mobile, to move up. Small agriculture can continue. It does continue for a certain niche market here, whether it's organic or not, let that be to the side for a minute, but it's not going to be the solution for everything. Of the 500 million farms that we have, farm families, I should say, that we have today, the majority are small farmers. But a very large percentage of them will not continue. They don't have the children that want to continue to be farmers unless we make being small and growing something attractive through investments, possibly subsidies, a promotion of farming. My biggest worry, among the many worries I still have, is that we won't have a next generation of farmers. Small is not the solution. Small is also not the solution necessarily because it doesn't yield enough. And as I said before, we need to keep as much land as we have for other purposes, whether it's nature conservation, carbon fixation, and so on. But also, small farmers are in a very difficult situation when it comes to feed those millions in the big cities. There's a transportation issue, there's a quality issue. That's really going to be one of the challenges. How do we feed Lagos with 20 million people, Mexico City with 25 million, and so on and so forth? Another misunderstanding is that we should continue or even go back to being local and regional. Globalization, it is said, has had really very dire effects on the world. And it's true, globalization led to a very strong competition, but it also helped countries to emerge who couldn't have emerged otherwise. Let me return again to the example of India. India has been able to take advantage of the need for internet and information technology and has really positioned itself in that field as well as in the field, as you probably know, of vaccine and pharmaceutical production. That would not have happened without globalization. Globalization has also helped China to lift about 1 billion people out of poverty because there was trade, because people could be employed in factories. Is globalization a good idea by definition? No. It needs a lot of regulation. And I think with the current geopolitical situation, we will probably move towards more regional blocks and more regional trade. But you have to realize, and please, when you are cooking your food tonight, look at the packages and you'll see, or you can at least think about where all the ingredients come from. Most of what we eat does not come within even 50 miles or 100 miles or within Germany or even within Europe. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. It's the interconnectedness through globalization that will help us. But there are also victims of globalization. And it's very important that we deal with these markets to reflect the true price of labor, a true living wage, as we call it, and do away with the negative, particularly the environmental effects of globalization. So these are some misunderstandings, but the basic misunderstanding is that we already know how to solve the problem of food, and therefore we don't need any more research. But let me say here in this audience, and I would be amiss if I wouldn't talk about research. Yes, of course, we need more research, but not necessarily the kind of run-of-the-mill research that is about increasing yields. First of all, we need a whole lot more of socioeconomic research that helps us to understand what food choices people make. Why do people eat badly when they have the possibility to eat better? Why are markets unregulated? What can we do to really avoid the negative side effects of subsidies, for example? The economics, I think, needs to be much more integrated with the way we look at agriculture and food production and environment. But there's also some high-tech stuff that we need to look at. One is the issue of labor that I mentioned before. I think the use of tractors, robotics, and smart agriculture in a technological sense is there to stay, and it will continue as labor forces actually diminish and farmers become really computer wizards. That's one dimension of the story. The other thing that often has, or is a focus for misunderstandings, is that we know that we don't need more genetics, and even the European Commission believes, or the European Court of Justice feels that modern genetics, that's known to some of you under the complicated name of CRISPR-Cas, is not necessary anymore. Yet I believe very strongly that it is by using the best genetics to make plants and animals more resistant, whether it is to disease, climate stress, and so on, that will help us for the future. That requires far more research. But there's more. We need research on these lower organisms in the food chain that we're not eating today. I don't expect there to be a major breakthrough in terms of having new, completely radically new cereals, for example. They will take, if you think of Ethiopian teff or Peruvian quinoa, for example, yes, they're there. The yields are still very low. Before we get them up to the 10 tons per hectare that we have for cereals in good years, or for wheat, I should say, in good years, that will take a long time. But bacteria, fungi, and even insects are interesting parts of the story that we have done too little work on. And if I turn to insects, yes, I know we're not very keen on eating insects. Nevertheless, if we use them in a processed form, or if we use them as animal feed, they will become literally more palatable. And just for those of you who think, well, locusts are not really my thing, to be honest, they're not mine either, although every single official meal that I organized at Wageningen had locusts in it, because we have to get used to them. But locusts actually look very much like shrimp. And the nice, or one of the nice Arabic terms for locusts is actually the shrimps of the sky. So maybe that makes them a little bit more palatable to you. In any case, I firmly believe that bacteria and fungi could be very interesting alternatives. Is that the way to go to lab meat, to meat grown in the lab rather than on animals? Perhaps. But the current price of a lab-grown meat is still extremely high. A couple of years ago, it was still over $20,000 a kilo, which makes it totally inefficient or inaccessible to most people. But yes, we can do better. But we also must do better, because the meat alternatives that we have today are highly processed. They are high in fat and salts, because otherwise they're not palatable. And we need to think about reducing salt and fats, for example, and sugar, and find new ways to do that. From a chemical point of view, I'm sure von Liebig would agree, that's not very easy. So there are lots of challenges. And particularly the challenges that come from a misunderstanding of what agriculture and food is all about are, to me, the most worrisome. I think we can do a lot of work. And when I say to you, can we eradicate hunger? Yes, we can. But the first story has to be peace and poverty alleviation. That is the bottom line. If there's no peace, there will be hunger. And it was George Marshall, who you know of the Marshall Plan, who said in, I believe, 1947, the enemies of peace are hunger, instability, and poverty. And that's still very true today for most areas. Those problems cannot be solved by technology or not even by policy alone. They have to be part of a massive peace effort, which I hope will still take place. So not all is well, and there are lots of challenges today. And let me address perhaps two groups in this room. One, of course, is the students. Please, whenever you do something, whether it's your doctoral thesis or read something, be critical. Be critical of yourself. Ask the right questions. Never take something for granted. But accept also that science and technology development are a process through which we organize our doubts. It doesn't give the final answers. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. But we must always be critical. You must have your own opinion. But you can only have your opinion if you're well informed and you read. So read, not just science, read novels, read whatever you can, because you also have to become a rounded human being and a being that can engage in dialogue with others, that's not just stuck to his or her own beliefs. And to those of you who are in administration and in all kinds of important positions, please help to make this whole issue of food and agriculture a priority again. It has disappeared, been fragmented into different ministries and different departments in university, and it's not anymore a coherent view. There's no country in the world that I know of that has an integrated food and agriculture policy, not even the European Union. We do bits and pieces, but let it be clear to all of you who work in Germany or in other European countries, there's not such a thing as domestic policy. Everything you do has international implications. And the reverse is also true. Development assistance has domestic implications. So lastly, let me tell you or share with you what my prize money is going to do. This really super amount of prize money. I have been thinking very hard the last few weeks about it, or I even talked with quite a few people. And what I'd like to do is to invest it in Africa. Africa was the continent where I first worked. It's the continent where we have the greatest problems in terms of food security. At the end of this very century, 2100, we will have 4 billion Africans, compared to 5 billion in Asia and 1 billion in Europe and the Americas combined. So Africa it's our neighbor here in Europe. It is the most important continent, the continent where are the greatest needs. So I've been talking to various universities in Africa to help them to work together and create a new group of leadership in integrated food and agriculture system thinking. One of my first publications, which Joachim has probably seen because it also came back as a chapter in my thesis, was about the difference between the Anglophone and Francophone approaches to agricultural science. And so I've decided I want to bring the French and the English-speaking countries together again. So I found the University of Pretoria for Southern Africa, and I found the Université Polytechnique 402, au Mohamed-VI, as the two partners who will actually also fund and help to match the funds that we will create and get the private sector to also contribute to creating a truly Pan-African approach, which will be open, of course, to others working in this area. So that's my idea. And let me express my immense gratitude for your wonderful words, which I don't deserve, but I'll make good use both of von Liebig's ideas and of the prize money. Thank you very much.
Louise, thanks for a wonderful lecture. It's fascinating to listen to you and your wisdom and how you put together all the different relevant aspects. It's even more fascinating to see that you're doing that without a single keyword.
Yeah, but I did think about it beforehand. I'm not improvising.
No, that's really great, and it certainly touches upon many of the things that our students and we ourselves are thinking about. Perhaps while the others are digesting and thinking of the questions, let me start with a question. You're mentioning the importance of research, but you're also reminding us that it's not only the technologies that are needed, it's the social science research. What we are really needing is also change of mindset in order to change behavior, in order to overcome some of the fallacies that you have been talking about. And I'm sharing your concern that, are we able to do that fast enough in order to really meet the challenges ahead? But I'd love to hear a few more sentences on what you feel needs to be done in order to change the mindsets and what role research, if any, can play in that. Perhaps it's other actors that play larger roles in that, but perhaps you see a role for research as well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the research itself, we need, and this sounds like an open door, we need more interdisciplinary work. I have seen actually throughout my life that we had a period of interdisciplinary work, and now I find universities to be extremely not polarized in a political sense, but polarized in terms of disciplines. And that's basically because of the enormous pressure on young scientists to produce a lot of papers, and it's always difficult to produce and publish really interdisciplinary papers. So if you're doing your PhD, you don't want to do something as broad as I was allowed to do at Wageningen at the time, because nobody cared that much. But today you have to publish in all kinds of high-ranking journals, and that's by definition not interdisciplinary. So one of the things I would look at in universities is, can we not create a situation where at least one of the papers for your PhD is a truly interdisciplinary paper? Before I came to Wageningen this last time, when I was a professor, we had a class on every Friday morning where the students were supposed to actually criticize a paper by somebody in another discipline. And the surprising thing is actually that you're quite able, even if it's not your subject, to get to the bottom and really understand whether something is good research. So that is the first answer. The thing I think we're not doing very well in terms of the substance is that we have agriculture, that's a big subject, and there's crops that get even more important. Then we have the animals. And by the way, I didn't mention the animals very much, but there are some major issues of concern there. Microbial resistance, for example, zoonotic diseases. So that is an area in itself. But the linkages between food production, food processing, supermarkets, and the whole food chain, including the challenges that I mentioned on energy, for example, how will we make this sustainable? That's not clear at all. And in fact, we have the Sustainable Development Goals that you know of the UN. We still have, and those of you who haven't read it, I won't ask you, but do read the original Brundtland report. 1986, it came out, and it was called Our Common Future. And I still think that vision that we are, as mankind, one group, and that we have a common future, and that therefore we need to talk about sustainability. Nachhaltigkeit, the word came from the German forestry science. That still is very much something that we, that we need to get again. And to get that kind of approach, to get that perspective on sustainability in whatever people do, I think is extremely important. Now, sustainability also profoundly irritates me as a subject, because we still cannot quantify it decently. It's very hard. You can quantify bits and pieces, but the totality is very difficult. So that, I think, is something that also needs some more work than we have done today. But lastly, I would say there's also a huge task for those who fund research, the agencies, including perhaps some people sitting here. I find that the funding agencies have no patience. They want results by next year, or perhaps the year after, and they don't understand that some of the things cannot be predicted. So I see proposals all the time with the most incredible promises of what will happen if this research is funded. That's of course not how it works. Most research is a step-by-step process, and we should go away from these enormous promises and have much longer cycles of funding. And that really is something that I think all of us should work on. Otherwise, we will end up with little fragmented bits and pieces, and nobody knows how they belong together. And lastly, let's also always leave room for fundamental research. What von Liebig did, for example, on the carbon cycle, I think is still very much needed. I spent a lot of my last few years at Wageningen to try and set up an institute for photosynthesis, the basic process, that by which plants actually capture sunlight to produce carbohydrates. That process is so terribly inefficient for all kinds of biological reasons. If we can only improve that a little bit, we'll change the whole equation. That's fundamental research because we don't know how to do it. But we need room for fundamental research, we need room for long-term research, we need room for interdisciplinarity. Yeah, agroecology has different meanings for different people, but let me say, basically, everything in agriculture or in food or in society is actually ecology. If I mean by that, the interactions between both the biotic and the abiotic factors. And I think fundamentally that agriculture should think of itself as a science of applied ecology. So looking at the various the levels that ecology usually looks at from the gene all the way up to the landscape, and to look at the exogenous and endogenous factors mentioned by Joachim. There is no science of using living materials, whether it's plant or animals or bacteria, without ecology. When we apply it to agriculture or to food, of course, there are some special factors. For example, the fact that you need to use fertilizer unless you have a very fertile soil or you have another source of nutrients. But there's not such a thing as a free lunch. A plant needs to be fed. And if we take away plants from the land, then of course, the land will be exhausted after a while. And there's nothing as destructive, by the way, as annual agriculture in the humid tropics, because the land is so easily exposed to high temperatures and you destroy nearly all the organic matter at a temperature above 30 or 31 degrees. So ecology is absolutely essential. The only problem I have with the term agroecology, that when the Swiss use it or the French use it, or the Americans use it, it has different meanings. But as a science, the basic biological ecology is absolutely essential. That's absolutely true, and I was perhaps amiss, but there are many more things that I could have and should have mentioned probably. I think water is, of course, there's no plant growth, no animal growth without water. So that goes without saying. But the key here is both to protect against excess water and against water shortage. And in both cases, what we need is what we technically call water use efficiency. Most of the water that comes onto the land actually is wasted. We are, even if we irrigate, for example, we irrigate the land and not the root zone. So we can do much better with the water we have, even in dry areas. And in fact, the accessibility of solar power, for example, which becomes cheaper by the year, will make it possible to have highly localized irrigated areas. To give you just one statistic that I always find very telling, in China, 40% of the land is irrigated, the agricultural land. And their yields are about 40%, for example, of rice or wheat of what you can have in Europe or the US. In India, about 20% of the land is fully irrigated. Their yields are even lower. But in Africa, the percentage of land irrigated, even taking into account big schemes like in the Sudan for the Gezira for cotton, only 2 to 3% is irrigated. And that is a lack of investment. So in order to deal with water, we need to look at investment as well as in the water that comes from rainfall and use it wisely. Excess water, as you've had here occasionally last summer, and the drought this summer actually point to bad landscape management in many cases. We cannot change rainfall, but we can certainly change water storage. And in the Netherlands, a couple of years ago, we did a big exercise to see what would happen also to higher sea level or rising sea levels and to excess water. And the solution to that is twofold. It's actually every 30 or 25 years when infrastructure needs to be renewed, whether it's roads or electricity stations, to move them up a little bit. And on the other hand, to create real excess storage basins. We need that in many countries. There are enough rivers. And again, in Africa, we have lots of surface water that's not being used. Water quality is an issue, especially around cities, of course. That can be solved. There are very easy ecological ways, in fact, of filtering water. We can also do that with solar energy again. So I think there's a lot of potential to deal better with water. The reason why it's not being done is because agriculture and water are two different departments, and never will they talk to one another, even here. Yeah, I think if I understand you well, I think you're raising an important point, and that is, of course, effective research should never be done over the heads of the people who have to apply it. And this has happened very often for centuries, decades. On the other hand, there are areas where participatory research doesn't really necessarily help. My case in point being photosynthesis. I'm not going to ask farmers what they think about photosynthesis, let alone, as somebody recently mentioned to me, that it was really very strange that there is no feminist view on photosynthesis. So, there are limits to ideological approaches. But in many cases, when it comes to fertilizer or local production or land reform, a term I didn't mention, but which can be very important because these small farms become smaller and smaller, and at the same time they are abandoned. All that requires, of course, social science methods to deal with the differences of opinion, to deal also with the risk of outsiders, non-agriculture actors coming in. So yes, in that sense, there's a lot to be done, and unfortunately, local municipalities, for example, are not really prepared to do this. What I think is an interesting development is that the cities are making themselves heard, the big cities, because they feel also in the area of climate change, they have something to say. Now, the next step will be, I feel, to make cities also responsible for water management and for their food and agriculture. That's not to say that they should produce everything in a 50-mile radius around Hamburg or something like that, but to take that role, to understand their own food system, understand their dependencies, and involve the citizens in that, I think is a very interesting and promising part of research. This is an interesting issue, of course, because it's more difficult to organize the global south than it is to organize the EU. And even in the EU, this hasn't happened. I mean, we have a common agriculture policy, which is very much agriculture and a little bit about landscape and environment. But we don't have an integrated nutrition or food policy, let alone having this combined. I've been talking recently to various people, including at the African Development Bank, and to some people in countries like India and the Philippines about the possibility of exploring this as this is not something you do at once. So you have to sort of evolve this over time. But I firmly believe that the way our governments are organized or our university departments actually stand in the way of an integrated approach. And that's why it's so important for you as young students to question that, to look where you can build those bridges. To start with, you could start with an analysis of where does actually the food come from, whether it's about Manila or whether it's about the Philippines or wherever. Where does it come from? Where are the dependencies? Where are the weaknesses? How can the system actually work itself up to meet future needs? Where are the risk factors? To start with that and then evolve a policy from that, I think would be a very useful exercise for about every country that I can think of in the world. What would I have done 10 years ago? Well, actually, this sounds terrible, probably, and it goes against everything that I've just said about life is a learning process, and the day I don't learn, I will be dead. But I do think that, strangely enough, and again, this was not planned, I've been really quite consistent in formulating these ideas. And if you look at my book from 2012, the one about the hamburgers in paradise, you'll see many of these issues. There are a couple of things that are not there as pregnantly as they are today. For example, climate change was not in the same way an issue. But I think basically building bridges and creating a new group of leadership is something that I feel very strongly about. And although we have wonderful individuals, and I'm sure they're sitting in this room with wonderful careers ahead of them, I find that bringing people together and having them talk about their responsibilities, about their countries, or about wherever they are in the private or in the public sector is really very helpful. It's the misunderstanding also between the private and the public sector and academia that really worries me. And so in that sense, I think we can certainly use some of that money, and I could have used it 10 years ago. Well, food losses are still, that's your second question, are still a big issue. 1/3 of what is actually produced on the field does not reach the stomach of the consumer. The reasons are very different. In affluent countries, it's because we buy too much, we throw away too much. You know what is the product that's thrown away most in Germany or in the Netherlands or Northern Europe? It's bread. Why? Because we're not used anymore to eating bread that's older than 1 day, which is absolutely ridiculous. And all of you know from your mothers probably lots of recipes to do something with old bread. But we throw away a lot of bread. We throw away a lot of vegetables and fruits unnecessarily. So this is for the circular economy is so important because we will continue to throw things away. But we will also learn, I think, to really purchase more wisely, to look at the shelf life of things. There are many actions there, and soon we will have a QR code on everything. So even your fridge will tell you, tonight you have to eat your spinach because tomorrow it will be off. This is just a matter of time. But I think we have to do much better to address the losses in many developing countries, because there the losses are not so much at the consumer level, but at the post-harvest level. It's when the food or the crop or the animals are still in the field or being slaughtered that there's a lot of waste. That is unnecessary and sometimes totally artificial. If you look, for example, at the transportation of tomatoes from Mali through to Senegal, they are held at the border for sometimes as much as 3 weeks. Well, there's no tomato variety that can survive that. It's totally unnecessary. Besides, they have an union douanière, a customs union. But still, it happens. So these things should be part of a policy to move food quickly to the consumer, to do away with storage losses, which often are losses due to rats, to insects that are unnecessary. So it's a matter of education, it's a matter of organizing markets. But the fact that 1/3 of the food or the food ingredients are actually lost is totally unacceptable. And if you would take food losses as a country, it would be the 3rd largest CO2 emitter or greenhouse gas emitter of the world. That's the order of magnitude. That we can do much, much better. Well, I think we need both. We also need still a lot of technical work, as I said before. I mean, I would like to be able to use bacteria and enzymes to produce food in areas, for example, where it's difficult to do so otherwise. But I think we shouldn't call it sociology, because at least at Wageningen sociology these people are far away in a corner. They never want to talk to the technicians at all. Biology is a dirty word for them. So that's not, this may not be true in here in Bonn and elsewhere. But what we need is, again, a systems approach whereby we understand what are the limiting factors. That can be human behavior, but it can also be policy. It can be the combination of market regulation and technology, for example. I think that information technology will help us very much both to inform behavior and adequate behavior by consumers, but also to anticipate on, for example, shortages. And so it's I think, using modern technology to understand also people's behaviors, as the Amazons of this world are doing, but they're not applying it to agriculture and food. So we need a fresh look, a fresh approach for sociology or agro-sociology, or what you want to call it.
What a wonderful afternoon here at Bonn. I'm so thrilled about your lecture here, showing us your clear vision to overcome hunger and poverty, and giving us food for our thoughts, and showing us what challenges are ahead of our work we have to do. I have to stress the word gratitude, which goes to Joachim von Braun. He himself, as a recipient of our award 2011, thank you for the laudatio that presented the eminent work of Louise Fresco. Thank you to Martin Keim, who guided us through the afternoon. And I think both Martin Keim and Joachim von Braun stressed the long-lasting partnership that Fiat, Panis and ZEF are now, I think we are in the 12th year of spending money for field work of here, the students. And it was in the beginning when Professor Braun, when Fiat Panis started, asked me what kind of car I'm now looking for, how I would like to design my office. And I told him I'm open-minded for any suggestion what we could do. And he said, look here, ZEF needs some money for doing good field work. The students need good money for doing field work. And I think we did a lot in the last years. And my gratitude goes also to the members of the jury in selecting our award recipient of this year. Thank you for helping us to promote the work of the foundation and Dr. Iserland's foundation. And I'm so deeply pleased regarding, I was not really aware what will happen here at ZEF. I'm deeply pleased regarding all the helping hands here of the members of the Center of Development Research, like Silke Tonsjost, Alma van der Veen, and so many that showed me there is a lot of good spirit and hard work that makes this event happening and successful. Thank you. And finally, thank you to this fine audience. I'm standing here in front, and I'm so happy to see so many friends of the Iserland Foundation, the Foundation Fiat Panis, so many research partners, recipients of our awards. This is a wonderful evening for me, and we are looking for one important task: to end hunger on planet Earth. When Dr. Hermann Iserland met in 2009 the newly founded jury, it was only Frank Plessmann who was that time on the board, and many others like Hartwig de Haan. He shared his intention for this takeover of the Justus von Liebig-Award by his foundation. I quote, "We live in a prosperous period in Europe. But on the other hand, the critical world food situation has gained in importance. It imposes on us the obligation to help in order to helpfully achieve a world without hunger. My father and I have dedicated ourselves to this task since 1960. Since 1982, our foundation has striving for this. Therefore, the Liebig Award should be aimed at persons fighting hunger and poverty in the world." today Dr. Iselin's intention is fulfilled, and I hope we all will take on the obligation to help in order to achieve a world without hunger.
Shake it.